Dohnanyi, the pianist. We are now broadcasting a program of personal reminiscences about Ernst von Dohnányi, recorded by his friends, colleagues, and pupils. Appearing in the program are Sir Adrian Boult, Ilona Kábos, Béla Siki, Joseph Weingarten, Louis Kentner, Georg Solti, Bálint Vázsonyi, and Antal Doráti. The program was devised by Dr. Alan Walker, who also introduces it.
Dohnanyi was one of the great pianists of his time. This fact often surprises the younger generation of musicians, who tend to remember him chiefly as a composer. We've almost forgotten that for the first 30 or 40 years of this century, Dohnanyi dominated the piano-playing fraternity in Central Europe as few musicians have dominated it before or since. For many years, Dohnanyi was the director of the Music Academy in Budapest, where he also held master classes in piano playing, a position which enabled him to exercise a decisive influence on generation after generation of pianists. He gave hundreds of public recitals himself, and older musicians still talk about them today. What sort of a pianist was Dohnanyi? 8 distinguished musicians are going to try and answer this question for us. Some of them knew him intimately. Others met him only on infrequent occasions over many years. 1 or 2 merely encountered him in a professional capacity once or twice in their lives. But all of them are agreed about one thing. Dohnanyi was unlike any other pianist of his time. His method of playing, the quality of sound he produced, his prodigious musicianship, all these things set him apart. And in this program we're going to try and reconstruct a picture of Dohnanyi's unique personality as it emerged through his piano playing. Here is Sir Adrian Boult, who first met Dohnanyi in 1928.
Of course, as a general musician, he had the distant grasp. I mean, he seemed to tower over whatever he was doing, very much in the same way that Busoni did. As Francis Toy once said about Paderewski, he was a great man playing the piano to us.
Ilona Kábos first heard Dohnanyi play when she was a young student at the Budapest Academy of Music.
You cannot talk about Dohnanyi's piano playing only because it was more than piano playing. Dohnanyi, in my opinion, was perhaps the greatest performer, greatest interpreter. He completely understood the composer. He absorbed the music. And then, when he sat at the piano in front of his listeners, he recreated the music there and then.
Joseph Weingarten was a pupil of Dohnanyi's in the 1930s.
I have heard over the years many eminent pianists, but for the satisfaction of listening to music, played solely for music's sake, for the sheer beauty of sound and deep musical experience, I have heard no one to excel Dohnanyi.
There are 2 aspects of Dohnanyi's piano playing which everybody who ever heard him play always talks about. The first was his unusual spontaneity, and the second was his unique touch. Dohnanyi never unfolded a work twice the same way, and yet he was never unfaithful to the composer's intentions. Ilona Kábos has described his recitals as composing at the piano. Bálint Vázsonyi, one of Dohnanyi's last piano pupils, Georg Solti, who was a composition student of Dohnanyi's, and Ilona Kábos now discuss this aspect of his personality. The musical illustration, Cascades, is one of Dohnanyi's own pieces which he recorded at his last public recital in Florida when he was 82 years old.
He had an extremely free way of performing. Playing the piano was something like speaking a native tongue. And this incredible spontaneity and this natural approach to performing distinguished him from all the others.
His piano playing was in a way legendary, but he never practiced. It was his belief that one shouldn't practice too much because it hurt your musical imagination. But what I admired was his great ability to create a piece. Really freshly create. It was masterly.
He was born with this natural technique, which could do anything. And he gave recital after recital in Budapest, as many as perhaps 20 in a season. Always different programs, always ready for them, never practicing them, sometimes not even looking through the piece which he was supposed to play that night. It was something unique, it was something miraculous, and of course that again was the reason why everything was so fresh. Nothing was sort of rigid or practiced or pre-calculated. That didn't exist with him.
Dohnanyi at 82. The other widely discussed characteristic of Dohnanyi's was the unusual quality of his touch. Georg Solti.
He had a beautiful sound, a singing piano sound. I seldom heard more beautiful singing sound which he had. I never forget the G major piano concerto second movement, this recitative on the piano with orchestra. I have still in my ears that wonderful singing quality of his playing. It was beautiful.
Bálint Vázsonyi.
What distinguished him more than anything else was his touch, the tone he could produce from the instrument. I was told by many, just about by everybody who ever heard him on the stage, that his tone, his piano tone, was the most unique that any pianist produced in this century.
the slow movement of Schubert's G major sonata, opus 78. What do we know about Dohnanyi's musical origins? Who were his teachers? Here is Louis Kentner, who heard Dohnanyi play on many occasions.
I knew very well both his teachers, Stephen Thoman, a Liszt pupil, and Hans Kessler, a German follower of Brahms, who also taught me composition many years after he taught Dohnanyi, Bartók, Kodály, Leo Weiner, and others. But I doubt if either of these worthy men, excellent in their various ways, had much to impart to this young genius who, like Pallas Athene, came fully armed into the world.
Every musician who knew Dohnanyi has testified to his extraordinary memory, which enabled him to reproduce a page of music after a single glance, and they also testify to his unfailing powers of improvisation, which remained unimpaired to the end. Bálint Vázsonyi recalls Dohnanyi's performance of Mozart's D minor piano concerto.
I think he was the first pianist in Central Europe to perform all Mozart concerti, and since there are many that do not have a cadenza written by Mozart, or at that time by anybody else, he usually played his own cadenzas. Most of the time he didn't really compose them, he just invented a sketch of some sort, and he actually improvised the cadenza on the stage. I think he was one of the last pianists to do so in public. At any rate, at this particular performance, he improvised the cadenza for the Mozart D minor concerto, and he told the conductor that when a certain trill arrives, the orchestra may proceed with the coda. Somehow he got himself lost in one of the keys, and when he tried to approach D minor again, at the end of a run he hit a wrong note, and the run just didn't sound like being D minor, and the conductor was standing there all ready to bring in the orchestra. But when the wrong note was struck, he didn't know what to do. Dohnanyi gave him a sign that he should wait, and he started improvising all over again. And he worked his way back to D minor. As incredible as it may sound, at the final run, something went wrong again, and the conductor's arm was caught in mid-air by the strange effect that was produced on the piano, and again Dohnanyi gave him a sign to wait and started improvising a third time, and finally he reached the concluding trill, and the orchestra could come in. At the end of the concert, the audience rose in ovation to express their amazement at this incredible power.
Ilona Kábos.
Dohnanyi's musicianship was really miraculous. I mean, his sight reading, score reading, his memory were quite incredible. Once he gave a recital for students at the academy, and he played, amongst other things, the Album for Jugend by Schumann. He played those little pieces just divinely. Then he came to a piece called Kleine Fuge, a little fugue. It's a three-part little fugue in A major, 6/8, about 3 pages long. He started playing it. It's a very sparkling, lively little piece. He played it, and I somehow thought, oh, funny, I knew this piece. Well, I forgot about it. I didn't recognize it. After the concert, Dohnanyi laughed his head off. He forgot the theme of the fugue, improvised a 3-part fugue in 6/8 in A major, in Schumann style. It was perfect. It could have been Schumann. And then he was very proud of his new composition.
Louis Kentner and Antal Doráti talk about Dohnanyi's sight reading.
He was a sight reader, au concours. I know this because I have actually witnessed the sight reading competition Dohnanyi entered into with another famous pianist as a kind of joke. Dohnanyi glanced briefly at the unfamiliar manuscript, then asked, "Into what key do you wish me to transpose it?" Upon this, his adversary resigned.
One of his great feats as a very small boy was when he read the G major sonata by Brahms for violin and piano, which he has never seen. It was brand new then, and played it without a fault. And the next day or the same afternoon by memory.
Joseph Weingarten.
I've heard it told that on a certain occasion he telephoned his impresario inquiring whether he had a concert that evening, and as this was the case, he asked, "And what is my program?" So he hurriedly dressed, and his only preparation was a glance through the music in the taxi.
Sir Adrian Boult.
I remember an occasion when he came to the BBC after the orchestra was formed in 1930. He played the Brahms D minor pianoforte concerto, and I was most intrigued because once or twice I found him bursting in on some orchestral matter. The point being that by that time he'd conducted it so much more often than he played it, or generally much more recently than he played it, that he made one or two mistakes by playing the orchestral stuff as well as the piano part. It was a great performance because it was the mind of the interpreter, not just of the pianoforte part, but of the whole work. The whole concerto was in his mind.
Béla Siki.
I remember one of my colleagues in the lessons was a nervous type of man, and he never could play without memory lapse of anything. And I remember it happened with Les Adieux Sonata. He couldn't get through this first movement, and Dohnanyi listened with much sympathy, and well, after he sat down and said, "Now look, what can happen to you? Say you start the first movement just there where the allegro starts," and he started it, and well, say here something happens to you and you don't know how it goes on. Well, he said, "You just do something like this," and he did something which was absolutely fantastic. And, well, you will meet the second subject, which you obviously know, you see. And here you are, he said. And it was so beautiful, so you all stood up. It was fantastic.
Ilona Kábos sums up.
Well, of course, this mastery of not only the keyboard, but of music itself, gave him the most wonderful advantage a performer can have. He didn't know what it was to have nerves. There were no nerves, there was no stage fright, there was nothing. Once he was sitting at a piano with an audience there, he was at home. It was his world. Nothing could happen to him. I mean, some wrong notes did never bother him. That was nothing. And no one cared about them because he gave so much. It was just heaven.
The great value Dohnanyi attached to musical spontaneity coloured his entire attitude to performance, and his critics often accused him of carelessness in his playing. What kind of a technique did he have? Here are Bálint Vázsonyi and Ilona Kábos.
It might be interesting to recall that when once a student asked him how much a pianist should actually practice a day, his answer was that this is a very individual matter and each pianist needs a different amount of time to keep up his technique. As far as I'm concerned, he said, I actually only need 15 minutes a day to keep in shape. Now, I don't say that I really develop at this 15 minute per day rate, but it is enough for me to keep in shape.
He wrote for himself a few concert pieces, transcriptions, I think simply because he wanted to have a few virtuoso pieces to end concerts with, or in case he needed them somewhere. And of course these brilliant transcriptions were written by him, for himself, for his hands, for his fingers, so that he didn't need to practice them. And they sounded brilliant, and they are terribly hard pieces, but for him it was child play. It was simply nothing.
musical illustration was a piano roll Dohnanyi made in 1928 of his concert study in E major. One important question remains. Dohnanyi was born into an age which teemed with great piano virtuosi. Busoni, Rachmaninoff, Paderewski and Sauer, they were only a few of his great contemporaries. How did Dohnanyi compare with these pianists? Here are Béla Siki and Joseph Weingarten.
Dohnanyi was this kind of genius who got everything ready without any work. Busoni probably was this kind of genius who had to work very hard to get to this very high level where he got. Dohnanyi probably born with all masterpieces, the most difficult masterpieces of the repertoire, in his head and in his hands. This make him so different from anybody else.
I have sometimes been asked how Dohnanyi's playing compared with that of the other pianists of his time, such as Busoni, Rachmaninoff, Sauer, and others. It is very difficult to make such a comparison, as his individual lyricism, his unfailing instinct for form, and his treatment of the instrument all set him apart. A famous critic comparing Dohnanyi's playing with Emil Sauer's said, "In Sauer's playing, his soul broke through the instrument. In Dohnanyi's, the piano becomes the soul." Rachmaninoff may have created greater dramatic effects and possessed a more obviously brilliant technique, but Dohnanyi's magic touch, an uncommonly warm, velvety, yet full-toned one, made him the equal of the greatest pianists of his time.
There is, of course, a practical difficulty which stands in the way of a direct comparison between Dohnanyi and those pianists who were his contemporaries. None of them made enough gramophone records of the same works to make such comparisons worthwhile, and personal reminiscences can, at the most, convey the aura, hardly the essence, of a man's playing. But when it comes to a comparison between Dohnanyi and modern pianists, the situation is rather different, for nowadays there are dozens of gramophone records of the same work to choose between. What can we learn by making such comparisons? Not that Dohnanyi was better or worse than his successors, but that he was different. It might help us to arrive at a definite picture of what, for want of a better phrase, we might call the Dohnanyi style. A work Dohnanyi made very much his own was Beethoven's E major sonata, opus 109. Listen first to Solomon's beautifully controlled performance of the first page. And now, Nikita Magalov playing the same passage in a much stiffer, metrically exact manner. Finally, here is Dohnanyi. Notice the leisurely tempo, the bold phrasing, and the extremely free use of rubato to point the climaxes. It's a composer's performance, played with an inner understanding of what the music is about. Bálint Vázsonyi, Dohnanyi's last pupil, summarizes his qualities as an interpreter.
When composers and conductors play the piano, their great advantage over mere pianists is that they convey a grand vision of the work, unblurred by petty details and pianistic worries. This approach, however, tends to lack the true commitment of the pianist, making the performance too approximate. Dohnanyi combined the virtues of both approaches, and it was this that made his playing so unparalleled. Also, while having the most superb theoretical knowledge of music, surpassed by none, and using the same to build up a performance perfectly designed in structure, he was able to appear to his listeners as the incarnation of spontaneity.
Like many other musicians of his generation, Dohnanyi viewed the rise of the gramophone record with suspicion. He could never rid himself of the view that gramophone records were essentially unmusical. He made only a small handful of records throughout his entire life, and these aren't really typical of him at his best.
He would never hear of recording a work in parts, and he would never allow the technicians to edit his recordings. He insisted on playing the entire work, and if there was any mistake, if anything didn't justify that take to be released, he insisted on repeating it as long as there was anything to be objected to. Even in early days, he disliked the idea of recorded music, of machine-made music, to such an extent that, as we know today, it resulted in the unfortunate fact that he has very few recordings available. But I think he had good reasons, because the recordings, even the best ones, never do justice to his performance. And actually it finished his life that he did accept an invitation to make 2 records. In 1960, he was almost 83 at the time, and he was recording for 2 weeks, 6 hours a day, and since he insisted on playing the pieces as a whole, he made it much too difficult for himself. And because of the unfortunate circumstance of the studio not being properly heated, he became very ill with high fever halfway through the recording session, and even so he insisted on finishing it. And this fever suddenly resulted in a heart attack, which unfortunately was not recognized by the doctors early enough. And so he died actually in 36 hours within the time he finished the recording session.
Dohnanyi playing the Arioso from Beethoven's Sonata in A-flat major, opus 110, the last music he recorded. It's hardly surprising that this great pianist, who was also such a great all-rounder, should have made an inspiring teacher. Dohnanyi taught the piano for nearly 60 years. Hundreds of pianists passed through his hands, many of them distinguished. From 1905 to 1915, he was professor of piano at the Berlin High School for Music, but his real impact as a teacher was felt when he returned to Budapest and took master classes at the Academy. He held these classes without a break for about 25 years, and they left an indelible stamp on subsequent developments in piano playing. Joseph Weingarten joined Dohnanyi's master class in 1932.
By 1932, I had been studying music at the Royal Franz Liszt Academy Budapest for 7 years, and was now ready for the master class. It was my great good fortune and privilege to be accepted by Professor Ernst von Dohnányi. Although there were every year at the Academy many pianists preparing for the artist diploma, Dohnanyi's master class was a small one, for he took only 4 or 5 students for the 2-year course. It was well known at the Academy that Professor Dohnanyi was very particular as to whom he accepted. Once a would-be pupil was asked her age and said 28, to which Dohnanyi replied, "I am afraid you are too old." When she riposted, "If I had said 18, would you have taken me?" His answer was, "In that case I would have said you were too young."
Louis Kentner.
His pupils told me, I was never one myself, that on rare occasions he gave them inspired and inspiring performances instead of any verbal comment on the pupils' playing. These were great moments, cherished by all, but generally he was bored by having to explain to others what came so naturally and easily to him. He frequently lay down on the sofa while one pupil played, and one never knew whether his monosyllabic grunts were critical comments or snores, or perhaps both all at once.
Everything came so easily to Dohnanyi that he was often puzzled by the difficulties experienced by his pupils. In 1943, Béla Siki, who was then a student at the Budapest Academy, won the Liszt Prize. The morning after the competition, he became a pupil of Dohnanyi's.
I remember I walked into his class next day, actually, of the competition where he was adjudicator, and he did hear what I had done. And, I thought I won't play anything. I just come in, you see, and we will discuss the plan for the year. And Dohnanyi said, "Well, what are you playing today?" And I was so surprised. I said, "Master, you know, I played yesterday for the competition. I thought it was enough." He said, "Well, you could have prepared something since yesterday evening. But, what have you done until now?" And I told him all the greater works I worked until there. And he had a little reflection and said, "Well, next time you will play the Emperor Concerto." And it meant in 1 week time. And I said, "But Master, I never played the Emperor Concerto. How could you expect I play in a week time?" And he said, "But you have a complete week for it."
Other pupils tell similar stories. Back to Vázsonyi.
It might be interesting to quote the story to show his attitude toward his pupils. One of the members of his first master class had a nightmare one night that Dohnanyi asked him in the morning to prepare the Mendelssohn violin concerto for his afternoon lesson. And the pupil said, "But maestro, I don't play the violin at all." And Dohnanyi answered, "Well, what do you want? You have 3 hours left."
In the presence of such a strong personality, it would not be surprising to learn that people were overawed and intimidated by him. But such was not the case. Bálint Vázsonyi describes his first encounter with Dohnanyi.
When I arrived to Tallahassee, Florida, I was called to his house the first evening, and I was sitting in the lounge waiting for the master to appear, shaking all over, needless to say. And suddenly a door was flung open, and a very small man came in with extremely blue eyes with the sunshine in them. It might sound very strange for me to say this, but actually there were two light spots in his eyes at all times. He came in, he had very wide gestures, very typical gestures of his hand, the way he threw them apart. He greeted me like an old friend or a grandson whom he hasn't seen for some years. And it was absolutely incredible. He radiated an air of informality, I don't know what better word to use for this, which simply paralyzed you. In the first moment, it was so strange from a man who for 50 or 60 years enjoyed an almost worshipping reputation from the entire world. There was nothing in him that reflected this reputation, except that when he spoke about music or played the piano, you felt a type of reverence that, well, this may sound exaggerated, but it's the type of reverence you feel in a church.
Antal Doráti was a small boy when he first met Dohnanyi.
My first recollections of his were from my very early childhood, when he was in our house, in the apartment of my parents, as a member of the family, because he was then married to my aunt. And he also dominated that household as he dominated everyone. He played the piano for hours, and it was the most admirable atmosphere and the most wonderful experiences for a small boy to hear it. And he influenced me in more ways than one. He played the piano always with a cigarette dangling from his mouth, and I envied this tremendously, just as much as I envied the piano playing, which I wanted to imitate. So when everybody left the house, I sat at the piano and got me a cigarette and started to play and smoke, and it was very unsuccessful. The playing wasn't so good either, but most of it I choked. So I had to give up one of the two things, and the first to give up was the cigarette. Later on I gave up the piano too.
My first encounter with Dohnanyi almost turned into disaster for me. I was a student of Professor Sandy's master classes at the Franz Liszt Academy of Music in Budapest. Sandy himself was one of the last pupils of Liszt. For some reason, he didn't like Dohnanyi at all, and he very much resented his students going to hear him. I didn't know much about this, and when I was first taken to hear Dohnanyi, I went completely crazy. I got so much under his spell, I adored that. It was something quite new, it was a revelation to me. So much so that the next morning when I went to attend my classes, I couldn't resist and started raving to my professor about the concert. He looked at me with very cold eyes and said, "Well, if you like Mr. Dohnanyi's playing so much, what are you doing here in my class?" So I got pretty frightened because I didn't want to be chucked out of the academy, but then I looked at him very nicely and he forgave me and relented. Of course, I still went to every concert I could to hear Dohnanyi, but I never talked to my professor about him again. But to go and hear him play, by sitting there, I learned more than in all my years of the academy, because he was such a one-time great performer. I don't think it ever happened again.
He was a very gentle man in every sense of the word. A grand seigneur, if you want that way. He looked also like a grand seigneur. He was very soft and very gentle. Never a harsh word out of his mouth, never. Bit ironical sometimes. Not very much. Very likable, very nice.
Antal Doráti.
He was very even-tempered, very happy man, always smiling, talked with enormous gestures, 2-yard-wide gestures his hands always made. They were always like a windmill. Also, again, until his very late years, always.
Yeah.
And very amiable. I never saw him angry.
In addition to his other activities as a teacher and concert pianist, Dohnanyi was also the chief conductor of the Budapest Philharmonic Orchestra. Sir Adrian Boult.
I invited him to come to Birmingham in 1928, I think it was, and he came to Birmingham in the triple capacity of composer, conductor, and pianist. He played the nursery variations, he conducted his Ruralia Hungarica, and he also conducted a very fine performance of Beethoven's Eroica Symphony. I remember very well the orchestra, very much impressed with this performance of the Beethoven. It was a masterly performance, the performance of a man of the Weingarten type, who thinks beyond the surface of the music.
In 1956, Sir Adrian Boult made a gramophone record of Dohnanyi's nursery variations with the composer at the piano. Dohnanyi made that recording in England in 1956. It was to be his last visit to this country. He had come over from America in response to an invitation to take part in the 10th Edinburgh International Festival. It must be to the festival authorities' everlasting credit that they invited Dohnanyi back to this country. It was a gesture which touched him deeply, for at that time he was still a political exile from his native Hungary. His very name was banned there until quite recently, and it gave him tremendous pleasure to play here again and renew old friendships. 4 years later, he was dead. Dohnanyi died in New York on the 9th of February 1960, a few hours after sustaining a heart attack. He was in his 83rd year. He died as he lived, making music. As we heard earlier in the program, he was playing Beethoven sonatas right up to the time he was taken ill. and it would be difficult to think of a more fitting end for him. His remains were returned to Tallahassee in Florida, where he had spent the last 12 years of his life teaching, and after a simple service, which passed almost unnoticed, he was buried there. To whatever place in musical history Dohnanyi is finally consigned, one thing is certain. He was one of the last representatives of a great tradition of piano playing in which it was not enough to be a virtuoso. One had to be a musician, too. Well, he was a musician.
Well, I can only say one thing. I would travel anywhere in the world if I could ever hear this magical playing again.
He had the distant grasp. He seemed to tower over whatever he was doing, very much in the same way that Busoni did. He was a great man playing the piano to us.
I have heard over the years many eminent pianists, but for the satisfaction of listening to music, played solely for music's sake, I have heard no one to excel Dohnanyi.
Taking part in that program of recorded reminiscences about Dohnanyi were Sir Adrian Boult, Ilona Kábos, Béla Siki, Joseph Weingarten, Louis Kentner, Georg Solti, Bálint Vázsonyi, and Antal Doráti. The program was devised by Dr. Alan Walker, who also introduced it.